Shadows of the Future by Storm Queen 873. Chapter 19.
Yes, my apprentice, do you have something to report?
Came the raspy voice over the communicator.
The target has been moved to the healer's wing,
the first shadow hissed, watching the Jedi sleep through his electro-binoculars.
He's in the perfect position for capture, as there are no masters around, but there is a little boy with him, the same one who never seems to leave his side. Instructions, my master. Shall I kill the child?
No,
came the slow response, as though his master was thinking.
Take them both unharmed if you can. The child can be used to make him talk, if he is reluctant to divulge any information.
It shall be done, my master,
he replied and cut the transmission. Anakin awoke with a start, something inside him telling him that things weren't right. He looked around, his lips twisting into a frown, and his eyes widened as they tried to pierce through the shadows of the medical room. He found nothing. Nothing a little at himself in annoyance, he carefully settled back against Obi-Wan, who remained asleep. Anakin woke up earlier that day when Qui-Gon moved to his stand, and he walked with the Jedi Master to the healer's wing, where they were going to make sure there wasn't anything wrong with Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan had nearly died, after all. Anakin didn't really like being there watching as a healer did some kind of scan on the Jedi, but he didn't have a choice. After concluding Obi-Wan was fine, only experiencing an extreme case of exhaustion, Qui-Gon said that he hadn't been sleeping, merely lowering himself into a healing trance, which according to him wasn't a good substitute for sleep. They said they would keep him overnight. Anakin really hadn't liked that idea, but it wasn't his decision, so he watched as they gave Obi-Wan some kind of mild sedative to ensure he got a full night's rest, no matter what happened around him. Then Anakin refused to leave. The healers finally compromised, letting him and Qui-Gon, who really didn't want to leave either, Anakin could feel it, stay in the waiting room down the hall. In the meantime, he and Qui-Gon went to get something to eat, as the Jedi Master hadn't eaten lunch, and Anakin couldn't remember eating anything all day. Then they returned to the healer's wing, setting up camp in the area given to them. Once Anakin was certain Qui-Gon had fallen fast asleep, he crept into Obi-Wan's darkened room and curled up beside the Jedi. He smiled when an arm looped around him. Even in sleep, Obi-Wan knew him and strove to protect him. He fell asleep quickly, tucked up against the Jedi, his ear listening for Obi-Wan's steady heartbeat. He'd been sleeping deeply, too, until something woke him. A shadow moved across his vision. Anakin jerked upright, opening his mouth to scream, but a gloved hand clamped down over it, shoving something down his throat. He swallowed reflexively, but tried to cough and gang it back up, struggling against the person's still grip.
Stop fighting,
it hissed, and something hit him upside the head, sending his world tumbling over and over. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring and his limbs shaking, and he saw a pair of smart black boots walk up to him. When had he fallen to the ground?
Come on, little brat. My master would like to meet you,
the person rasped, and Anakin peered up to find that the stranger had thrown the still unconscious Obi-Wan over his shoulder. No, Anakin muttered, his body feeling funny, like it was too exhausted to do anything. He tried to back away when the person reached for him, yanking him up by his wrist and then tucking him under his arm. Qui-Gon! He screamed into the energy around him, willing it to reach the Jedi Master in the other room. Qui-Gon, help! Obi-Wan and I are being kidnapped!
None of that now,
the person hissed, and another blow sent him spiraling into unconsciousness. Qui-Gon awoke with a start, neck protesting loudly and back groaning as he'd been sleeping on the bench in the waiting room. He found himself rolling off when he lost his balance. Uttering a muffled curse, he picked himself up and shook his head vigorously, trying to figure out what in the world had awoken him. Qui-Gon! Came the panicked shout, fear blasting through the force, and he jerked to his feet. Anakin! He looked around for the boy, and it was then that he realized Anakin wasn't on the opposite bench. Had he gotten up to go to the fresher and gotten lost? No, that theory was shot down when he saw that the pillow and blanket were gone. What had happened? Where had he gone?
Do you have to ask?
Qui-Gon muttered, rolling his eyes a little. Anakin must have crawled in with Obi-Wan, as he had been even more reluctant than Qui-Gon to let the Jedi out of his sight. Then what was wrong? Why was he so afraid?
It's Obi-Wan,
Qui-Gon realized, spinning and racing toward the room they put his apprentice in.
Something's wrong with Obi-Wan.
Qui-Gon, help! He heard Anakin call and tried to send back some form of reassurance to let the boy know he was coming. Obi-Wan and I are being kidnapped! What? That thought spurred him onwards, and he reached the door, slamming his palm down on the controls. It didn't open! Uttering a string of words, part of him hoped no child would hear. He tried the controls again with the same result. He then reached for his lightsaber, uttering the loudest curse yet when his hand groped empty. Of all the times to forget to clip it to his belt, the lightsaber lay next to his makeshift bed in the lobby, too far away to be of any use. And years of experience showed him nothing. Obi-Wan, he yelled through their bond and met with sleepy silence, part of him kicking himself repeatedly. How could he have forgotten about the sedative? Why had he even let the healers give Obi-Wan such a thing? Calm down, he told himself, and stretched out with the force, pulling and pushing the flimsy door open. The sight that met him once he managed to get into the room made him freeze. A hooded figure stood before the large window, which was smashed. A still sleeping Obi-Wan was slung over his left shoulder, while he held an unconscious Anakin under his right arm, both of them limp as rags. He had one booted foot poised on the windowsill as he prepared to jump into the waiting speeder, and when he glanced back at Qui-Gon, a feral sneer twisted his tattered features. "Stop!" Qui-Gon exclaimed, rushing forward as the Sith tossed Anakin into the backseat of the speeder. He then whirled towards Qui-Gon, holding up a hand. "Not today, old man," he hissed, and Qui-Gon barely had any warning when a powerful force push slammed into him, sending him careening back the way he came. He flew through the door, hitting the wall of the hallway with a painful thump, and his vision blurred when the wind was knocked from his lungs. Calling on the force, he steadied himself and picked himself up just as the Sith leapt into the speeder and flew away, his taillights disappearing into Coruscant night. "No!" Qui-Gon leaned against the mangled doorframe for a moment, reaching out with the force to try and follow the rapidly vanishing speeder. A powerful mental blow sent him reeling, and during those few precious seconds, any trace of the Sith vanished. "No!" He stood there, gripping the doorway and staring after the vanished speeder in disbelief. Part of his mind screaming that this was impossible. Just as things had started to return to normal as they could get, really, considering that his Padawan had the memories of a Jedi Master, the Sith resurfaced and decided to kidnap Obi-Wan and Anakin. Why, though? What would the Sith want with... They know. Qui-Gon thought with a trickle of fear, his posture stiffening. Obi-Wan knows which Sith is manipulating the Senate, and somehow they know he knows. Unfortunately, for all the memories Qui-Gon saw earlier that day, he hadn't seen anything that would tell him who the Master Sith was. He saw a lot of apprentices, from the Sith who'd been before him a few seconds ago to a turned Anakin, but there was no mention of the alter ego of the mysterious Darth Sidious. Somehow Obi-Wan kept that from him, even when he had no real control over what Qui-Gon saw. But why take Anakin, he mused. Why not just kill him if the boy was in the way? Unless... Qui-Gon spun away from the room, racing back towards his makeshift bed. He slammed his feet into his boots and hooked his lightsaber to his belt, throwing on his robe and leaving the healers. He needed to inform the council of this, and he needed to do so now, before the Sith could get far. They'd have to have all the ports closed, or at least have Jedi running checks on all outgoing ships to make sure they couldn't get off-world. They'd have to set up search parties to attempt to locate them. The Sith know Obi-Wan knows something, he thought in the back of his mind as the rest of him began forming possible plans to locate them. But they don't know what. That's why they've taken Anakin. I'm sure they've been observing us somehow. That's why they knew to attack tonight, when Obi-Wan was sedated, because it made things easier. They know Anakin can be used against him. Images began to flash through his mind of the most horrible things they could do to the boy, and he forced himself to stop. He had to remember that Obi-Wan had the skills of a powerful master. As strange as it was to admit, Qui-Gon knew that his apprentice was more than capable of handling himself and the situation. I will remain calm, Qui-Gon told himself, blowing out a breath. It won't help things if I panic. I need to meet with Mace and Master Yoda and discuss a plan of action, and the council must be told. What though? He wasn't about to tell them that his Padawan had been taken because he knew more about the Sith than all of them combined, since Qui-Gon would have to explain how Obi-Wan knew. That meant explaining about the memories, and how Obi-Wan had suddenly acquired master-level skills, ones many of them didn't have, because his soul had somehow aged 13 years. Qui-Gon had enough trouble accepting it as it was, with a large part of him still shaking his head over and over, telling him that it was all just some crazy dream and he'd wake up to find the galaxy turned right side up again. Yes, alright, that part of him argued. It did explain everything from the altered presence to the shadowed eyes, but such a thing was impossible! He would have instantly dismissed it as such had he remained unexposed to Obi-Wan's memories. He could barely begin to relate to the life his apprentice lived, where the Sith were a constant threat and where out in the field of battle, the enemy could be anyone. Qui-Gon realized how lucky he was that Obi-Wan hadn't cut his throat instantly upon waking, an action that, sadly enough, had saved his life many times.
No wonder I could barely recognize him,
Qui-Gon thought as he turned a corner.
He'd become a completely different person. Having Anakin as an apprentice, growing into a master, and fighting a war has given him a level of maturity that I thought I'd never see him achieve.
It must have been exhausting for him to hide it, to go back to being a Padawan again. He must have been chafing horribly every time Qui-Gon had given him an order, as he'd been his own master for so long.
Well, Qui-Gon thought, sighing a little, I got my answer to all the questions I had, and I have to say it went beyond any expectations I'd formed.
As for what they were going to do about Obi-Wan's sudden change, Qui-Gon agreed with Yoda that none of this could come out until after the council decided Anakin's fate, and though Mace was irked by it, he knew it wasn't fair to judge the boy on something he hadn't done yet. They hadn't come to a conclusion about Obi-Wan, and Qui-Gon's growling stomach finally put an end to their discussion. Mace laughed a little at that, and they decided to meditate and sleep before talking about it again. He still didn't know what to say to the council, though, without having it be an outright lie. He supposed that he could say he didn't know why the Sith had taken the two, which was technically true, because he only had suspicions. Yes, he did feel that they were correct, and his feelings usually turned out to be accurate, but perhaps he could pretend to go along with the council, who tended to call his hunches inaccurate assumptions. He doubted it would completely fool them, as Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn rarely agree with them. But if he started to discuss his ideas and had Yoda and Mace say that they didn't have time for his guesses, he knew the council would go along with it and let him alone.
It won't work, part of him whispered. They'll know you're hiding something.
Then perhaps if Yoda said that he and Qui-Gon had already discussed it? That wouldn't be a lie, as Qui-Gon intended to seek him out before going anywhere near the council. Yoda could get away with demanding a reprieve until after Obi-Wan and Anakin were found, and perhaps he could say that the Sith thought Obi-Wan knew something important, though he didn't know what. Then it all became a matter of actually finding them. Qui-Gon heaved a small sigh as he started for Mace's quarters, which were closer to the healers than Yoda's. The bond was utterly silent, though that was because Obi-Wan was out cold. Even once his Padawan awoke, though, who's to say the Sith wouldn't have some sophisticated way of shielding him? They certainly had been hiding themselves well, after all, and would probably just extend that to cover Obi-Wan. Would it silence training bonds? Qui-Gon had no way of knowing. Perhaps if he couldn't find Obi-Wan, maybe he could find Anakin instead. The boy certainly had a powerful force presence, one he had come to recognize quite well, but part of him huffed a little. He knew that the Sith would shield anyone they'd taken, even if they weren't a force sensitive.
One step at a time,
he told himself, forcing his mind to focus strictly on the present.
Talk to Mace and Yoda, see if they have any suggestions.
He set off to do just that. Mace Windu was having a wonderful dream. He relaxed before a giant waterfall, the gentle spray of the water brushing his skin, life feeding the living force around him, and he basked in the light, relishing the warmth. Then the door chime began to ring. Mace shook himself from his sleep, an un-Jedi part of him grumbling about it being only the second hour and how he should just shut his eyes and go back to bed. He tried to, rolling over and shoving a pillow over his head, and felt a rush of relief when the person came up on the chime. He growled softly then. The person was banging on his door. "All right," he muttered to himself, rolling off his sleep couch and groping for a rope to throw over his sleep clothes. He then stumbled through his apartment, rubbing his eyes and yawning, and palmed open the main door. "Qui-Gon?" he asked, squinting against the light of the hall as he tried to make out the tall, dark Jedi who stood on his doorstep. "You could have answered faster," the man grumbled, and Mace blinked once his eyes adjusted. It was Qui-Gon all right, his hair mussed from sleep, his clothes awry, and a worried frown on his face. "What's going on?" Mace asked, his words punctuated by a yawn. "What happened?"
Obi-Wan and Anakin have been kidnapped.
Mace blinked, his mind startling, fully awake. "You can't be serious!" Qui-Gon smiled tightly, his eyes dark.
"Oh, I am. It seems the Sith did indeed follow us to Coruscant and have now decided to make off with my apprentice. To what ends, however, I only have assumptions."
Mace thought for a moment before he stepped back inside his apartment and pulled his boots on. "Do you think they might know of his visions, memories?" he asked, watching Qui-Gon's expression darken. Yoda did say that it might be the key to staving off the approaching darkness. Perhaps they know this and are trying to neutralize him. Qui-Gon looked decidedly alarmed at that, and Mace winced a little at his choice of words.
Those are my worst fears.
Qui-Gon said as they started down the hall, heading towards Yoda's apartments.
But I think they have something else in mind first. Otherwise, they would have killed him in his sleep.
Mace nearly froze when he began putting different pieces together. Yoda said he might be the key to preventing something terrible. But in order for him to know how to prevent it, he'd have to know what it is, right?
Exactly. Qui-Gon said he knows how the Sith could rise to power.
He looked at Mace then, his eyes glittering in the low lights of the hall.
He told me earlier this week that he watched the galaxy spiral into chaos, that the worlds came crashing down. And what do the Sith ultimately want?
They want power, Mace replied, and they started walking again. Their pace doubled. They want to destroy the Jedi and reign over the galaxy.
That's also why they've taken Anakin. They want him for insurance, in case Obi-Wan is uncooperative.
Qui-Gon continued, and Mace suppressed a shiver. Dear Force, think of what they'll do to them, Mace whispered, and Qui-Gon shot them a look.
I'm trying not to, he said. We have to mobilize quickly. We can't let them get off-world. We'll have no way of finding them then, and Obi-Wan and Anakin will be as good as dead.
You need to get to Yoda, Mace said as they reached the lifts. I'll wake up the rest of the council and we'll get search parties together. The other masters must be told about your apprentice's vision, Qui-Gon. They're going to want to know why the Sith targeted him, and we have to give them a reason.
I know,
Qui-Gon whispered as the lift arrived.
I only hope we won't be too late.